How often does your job call you out of bed in the middle of the night? Well, if you were a doctor, it would be often. And generally, there isn't much time to spare.
Coffee, Doctor?
Oh, fine. Have a Camel with your coffee.
Thanks.
You know, this night work's kind of rough, isn't it?
That's right. But a Camel's always a pleasure.
Yes, folks, the pleasing mildness of a Camel is just as enjoyable to a doctor as it is to you or me. In a nationwide survey, doctors in all branches of medicine were asked, "What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?" The brand named most was Camel's. Tens of thousands of doctors, general practitioners, surgeons, specialists, doctors in every branch of medicine were included. And according to this nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Try Camels yourself, the cigarette so many doctors enjoy.
Hello, students. This is the video lecture about Chapter 12, which deals with advertising and some of the rules and regulations associated with advertising in the United States. I started off with an old commercial about cigarettes. I believe that the tobacco companies knew for many, many years that cigarettes were unhealthy and contributed to things like lung cancer and other health issues, although they did not want to publicly disclose that. So we had commercials that sort of advocated, they didn't say cigarettes are healthy, but they did say that doctors prefer this particular brand. And if doctors prefer the brand, well, by golly, shouldn't you as well? Anyway, I thought that was interesting, just as an example of how much times have changed. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, go through the PowerPoint slides, as is customary. And I'm recording this in a different location than I recorded the previous video lectures. I'm now in my campus office. You can see tapestry of Elvis right there. I'm a big Elvis fan. That is an image of a Marconi wireless school from more than 100 years ago, people doing wireless telegraphy. And over there, if you can see it, you can see it here. That is the Man on the Moon headline from San Diego Union. That newspaper is from July 12th, 1969. And I was alive to see that, although I was so young, I have no memory of that event. Here we go, advertising. Chapter 12, advertising, when speech and commerce converge. And here's another old cigarette ad. Anyway, I think that's kind of an interesting ad. Lucky Strike means fine tobacco. That was a very popular slogan for a long time. LSMFT. It also stood for Lucky Strike means fine taste. The definition of commercial speech can be a little tricky. I'll talk about that in a moment. But the courts have found that messages designed to promote commerce is covered in the U.S. Constitution, and the power to regulate commerce is covered. So from that, Congress has decided that the government does have the authority to regulate advertising, which promotes commerce. Anyway, commercial speech is regulable. Interesting word. I guess it means able to be regulated. The courts also look at the nature of the message when deciding what is commercial speech, and there is some First Amendment protection for commercial speech. Not as much for political speech. Political speech has the highest level of protection, but commercial speech does have some protection. The textbook, I'm looking at my notes, the textbook talk about the case Valentine versus Christensen, or Christensen, which some people interpreted to mean that commercial speech has no First Amendment protection. However, in Times v. Sullivan, which we talked about in another lecture related to libel, in the Times v. Sullivan case, the publication that was at the center of that was actually an ad. It was actually an ad trying to raise money for Martin Luther King Jr., promoting civil rights. So the nature of the speech kind of influences what level of protection that speech is going to get. And there is something called the Central Hudson test that defines commercial speech and puts some limit on regulations about commercial speech. Before we talk about the Central Hudson case, I just want to bring up the point that it is not clear oftentimes as to what is commercial speech and what is not commercial speech. Sometimes it is difficult even for consumers to recognize what is an ad, what is not an ad. Here we have an online ad from Campbell's. It appears on the allrecipes.com website. And this is called native advertising, where the ad is designed to look like the content that surrounds it. And it is oftentimes difficult for people to discern. So if you weren't paying a lot of attention, if you were rushing, maybe in the kitchen, on your iPad, and you're trying to find a recipe very quickly, you might glance at this and click on that Campbell's link, not realizing that's actually an ad. And I can pretty much guarantee that if you clicked on that link, anything that's going to come up is going to involve some type of Campbell's product, right? That's an ad. All right, the Central Hudson, let me close this a little bit. The Central Hudson test for determining commercial speech and the level of regulation, there's 3 parts to it, okay? The Supreme Court established that for non-deceptive advertising now, okay? If advertising is deceptive, it loses First Amendment protection. But if it's non-deceptive advertising, the regulations for that can only be applied if the government demonstrates a substantial state interest in the regulation directly advances that interest, and the regulation is no more extensive than necessary to service that interest. So if there is substantial interest that the government has in regulating advertising, whatever regulation, it can't sort of be overbroad and overreaching. The test has been applied in Puerto Rico, and the courts found that it was okay to regulate casino advertising. And then we also have the reasonable fit test, which, like many things with this topic and other topics, is a matter of subjectivity. What is a reasonable fit? But the courts do use that term. Now, the Constitution does not protect deceptive advertising. As I mentioned, misleading commercial speech loses its First Amendment protection. In the case known as Cincinnati v. Discovery Network, the courts found, this is about misleading, even if something is true, even if it's factually true, but maybe phrased in a misleading or confusing way, regulation could be justified. So if something is false, regulation is definitely acceptable. But even if it's true, but sort of presented in a misleading way, the courts have said that regulation may also be permissible. And we also have the Lanham Act that is central to what we've been discussing. I would encourage you to take a look at that particular passage of the textbook. I believe there are 2 paragraphs about the Lanham Act, but it pertains to this issue and has some of the finer nuances about misleading commercial speech. Now, the Federal Trade Commission is the main organization, Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission is the main government agency that oversees advertising. We also have the FCC and the FEC, but if you were asked, you would go with Federal Trade Commission as the primary government agency to regulate advertising. And if there were some concerns about something that was misleading, or if an advertiser made a false claim, there are different means that the courts can use to punish that. One example from the textbook was that the American Nationwide Mortgage Company was forced to cease and desist a direct mail campaign that had misleading advertisements. The courts can also order corrective advertising. This happened with Listerine, very, very famous case with Listerine. It's a mouthwash. Listerine was claiming that, it killed germs, and in doing so would stop you from getting a sore throat and would stop you from getting a cold, and other claims like this, which were blatantly untrue. And they were actually ordered to do corrective advertising, which is pretty embarrassing, saying that, no, what we said is not really true. And then there can also be injunctions which force a company to stop doing what they're doing. Now, this is a big area, and I know social media is a growth area, and many of y'all are no doubt interested in social media and working in social media. But there are required disclosures, okay? If you are doing an endorsement, you know, in print or on your blog or on your social media channel, if you've been paid to talk about a product, if you were given a product for free and asked to talk about it, you need to disclose that. You need to disclose that. You can't just, you know, you can't just go on your talk show if you have a talk show like Ellen and say, oh, I love this such and such new type of camera, without disclosing that the manufacturers of that new camera have given you money. Or in some instances, the celebrity may be the owner of that company or a co-owner of that company. I think many times social media influencers skip this or plead ignorance, but it is a rule from the Federal Trade Commission, and it also applies to native advertising. Okay, I talked about native advertising and showed an example of it. But if there is, say, something in a magazine, or let's just say an online website that's designed to look like all the other content around it, there needs to be some acknowledgement that, no, this is not regular content. Someone has paid for this. Someone has paid for this. Right now, I get Sunday newspaper in hard copy, and yeah, I'm old. I get the Sunday newspaper, and in one of the papers, I get three, but I think it's the LA Times. There is an insert that looks like the rest of the newspaper, several pages long, but it is entirely an ad to promote business and travel to China. It is something that no doubt the Chinese government is paying for, and it looks, if you were looking quickly at it, you'd say, wow, they have a whole section of the newspaper just devoted to China. No, that is an ad paid for by the Chinese government, and it does acknowledge that it's an ad, but you kind of have to look for it. Now, I mentioned the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, is the main agency, but the FCC, which we talked about when we talked about regulation of electronic media, does regulate some type of promotional content on TV, on public TV stations. Public TV stations are not stations that are seen by the public, but those are ones that are funded by viewers, funded by grants, and they receive a little small portion of funding from the federal government. They don't have advertisements. They are not allowed, public TV and public radio stations by law are not allowed to have explicit advertisements. They can have underwriting, which comes close to being a commercial, but underwriting cannot have a specific call to action or mention price. Okay, it cannot mention the price of something. So explicit ads are forbidden. And the FCC also regulates offensive broadcast advertisements, something that, you know, is deemed offensive could be regulated. Okay, children, I just put this image here just to sort of drive home the point that advertising to children is a matter of great concern. Just as with obscenity, children with obscenity and with advertisements, children are often held up as the most susceptible to damage, the most susceptible to confusion. Okay, so there are many rules and regulations associated with advertising to children. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where you are advertising a product to children, you should look up the specifics in whatever state you happen to be working, to make sure you're not doing anything that's incorrect. Several decades, or not maybe several, whatever, a couple decades ago, we had this Joe Camel character. I don't know if any of y'all remember this character, to promote Camel cigarettes. Joe Camel, you know, looks like a cartoon character. Government, the FTC, and courts found that this is a little too close to something that would appeal to children. So the Joe Camel character is no more. I'm going to play an excerpt from a podcast. The podcast is called Stuff You Should Know. They did an episode about history of action figures, which I thought was pretty interesting. And I was listening to it while I walked my little dog, and this segment came up that gave an example of how FTC rules about advertising literally affected what was on TV. They just didn't just affect the ads, they actually affected the content of a TV show. And I'll just summarize it before I play the clip. But what we have are changing rules about commercials and kids' cartoons. Rules were changed as part of deregulation that happened under Reagan. And it encouraged and allowed producers to make shows that were thinly disguised commercials for toys. So it was a commercial for a toy, but it was also a cartoon you could watch. And there was literal commercials inside the cartoon, but the whole thing is one giant commercial. And specifically, they talk about this G.I. Joe cartoon from the 1980s, G.I. Joe. Here we go.
And none of this would have ever happened had it not been for Ronald Reagan.
That's right.
And that sounds weird, but here's the story. So in the late 70s, there was a lot of concern about kids and advertising, about advertising to children. So the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, got a task force together, and they said, should we ban or regulate this marketing to children? They put together 6,000 pages of testimony from the oral testimony, 60,000 pages of expert testimony from all these experts on child psychology and health and nutrition, because it had to do with, food and sugary candies and stuff like that too. And the conclusion across the board was that young children they are cognitively unable to understand the intent of selling ads. They can't distinguish that from reality.
Right. Like if you dress up a cartoon as an ad, the kid he just thinks it's a cartoon, or she does.
Exactly. Or if the ad is a cartoon,
right,
rather than the kid doesn't know. They just think, I'm still watching cartoons on my TV.
My brain hasn't made that switch, but man, could I go for some Smurf cereal.
Exactly. So it was a big deal at the time. So there were all these recommendations basically on how to regulate and restrict advertising that they basically said was unfair and deceptive to kids. For older kids, they said they can tell the difference, but maybe we should have warnings on the ads and disclosures saying that this is a commercial message.
Right.
And so what happens when you do this in America? The private sector said, no. I want to be able to sell as much sugary garbage to kids as I want. You can't restrict
free trade
in business.
Yep.
And so we're going to raise a record at the time, $16 million to lobby against this.
And they were helped out in no small part by getting the right guy into the White House.
Right. So in 1980, one of the first things Ronald Reagan did was he appointed a new chairman of the Federal Trade Commission. And this was a move that basically said, you know what, there's going to be no regulation whatsoever. Got to leave these markets free. You can do whatever you want. And that is basically how all of these cartoons were born.
Right.
G.I. Joe, Transformers, Smurfs, Care Bears,
Rainbow Bright, Strawberry Shortcake.
Yeah, you name it. It basically became marketing and selling things and cartoons became one and the same finally.
And we also have a couple of different kinds of products which may be legal, but for various reasons, the government has decided there are valid and compelling reasons that these things need to be regulated. I have an image here of a tobacco ad, another tobacco ad. Blow in her face and she'll follow you anywhere. I don't think women really like having smoke blown in their face, but that's just me. Tobacco is one of those things. Gambling is one of those things. And all of these things are covered in the textbook. So just be aware that these products, where they may be legal or legal in some areas, have certain regulations. Alcohol, a lot of regulations associated with alcohol. Prescription drugs, okay, you know that there's regulations. That's why when they give a commercial, there's that disclaimer where they list all the possible side effects, okay? And guns. Guns is another product that, while it's legal, there are rules about where and when you can advertise that stuff. And we also have this unusual situation here in California where marijuana and cannabis is legal, but it is not legal in every state. federal law still prohibits it. This was the cover of the Daily Aztec, our own student newspaper from 2018. The 420 issue came out on April 20th. And, you know, this caused a big uproar in the CSU. As a faculty member, I was privy to some of this, and, you know, it went all the way up to the state chancellor's office being very, very upset about this. But, you know, cannabis is legal. Can the student newspaper accept ads for cannabis dispensaries? I believe as of right now, as of this recording, the Daily Aztec does not accept ads for any of these cannabis clinics. They did at one time, but it's a very, very gray area because, and just not to get too much into the weeds here, because San Diego State does get some federal money and some students do get federal loans, and there are some scholarships funded by federal grants, that the decision was made, it's better to err on the side of caution. And the student newspaper, even though it's independent, even though it's not controlled by the Department of Journalism and Media Studies, or it's not controlled by SDSU officially, better to avoid that. So as of this writing, Daily Aztec doesn't have ads for cannabis dispensaries, but it's just a gray area. Just know that it is a gray area. And I have a copy of the student newspaper. Yes, I saved it. I saved it, you know, just because I like that sort of thing. And we'll end with this slide right here. I mentioned that it's sometimes difficult to tell what is commercial speech, what is not commercial speech. There's a lot of companies right now that are trying to be woke. We're trying to, you know, endorse certain social causes. So if Pepsi, hypothetically, Pepsi comes out with an ad for Pepsi, but it's also an ad promoting Black Lives Matter, is that a social cause? Is that a political speech? Is that simply an ad for Pepsi? Or if companies put, you know, the rainbow pride flag on their product, like toothpaste, you know, hey, use this toothpaste. We support gay pride. Is that political speech? Is that promoting social cause, or are they promoting toothpaste? So that's just another evolving gray area. But puffery, I just want to say, is legal if it does not imply a factual claim. Okay, I repeat, puffery is legal if it does not imply a factual claim. If you said something like, our potato chips are the best potato chips in the world, the best potato chips you've ever tasted, that's puffery. That's an exaggeration. That's hyperbole. There's no way to really claim that. I did notice many years ago when I was in England, I spent some time in England, the ads there are very, very polite compared to American ads. I remember one that said, they call potato chips crisps, a crisp. The ad said, quite possibly the best crisp you have ever eaten. I thought that was so polite. Quite possibly the best crisp. Whereas in America, you know, they'd be screaming at you, the best potato chip, Sunday, 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 the best potato chip. That's okay. You can say that. Now, if you said our potato chip has less salt than our competitor, that's something that could be measured. But best potato chip, best tasting potato chip, there's no way to really test that. So that's okay. Anyway, I know there's a lot of subjectivity, a lot of gray areas here. But hopefully you got something out of it. And, you know, the video lecture along with the corresponding reading should give you some understanding, some basic understanding of some of the rules, regulations, and some of the kinds of products that could get you into trouble if you're not careful. That's it.